Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we are taking a look at another fountain pen ink. We are going to be taking a look at Noodler's Legal Blue. I am going to admit that this is one of my daily use inks. This is one of my favorite inks. I like this ink personally because I like the color of it. I like the fact that it works very well on a lot of papers, as well as this being a permanent ink. I generally use my fountain pens for art and drawing, and as such I prefer to use inks that are permanent, waterproof, light fast, so that if I draw something and decide that I want to frame it, or I give it to somebody and they want to frame it, it'll withstand the test of time and it'll look as good, however many years from now as it does the day that I draw it, hopefully. And so that leads me to have a lot of inks that are of a permanent nature, and a lot of those happen to be Noodler's inks. So in this test, I'm going to be drawing on several different papers. Most of them are art papers, because those are the kinds of papers that I typically use in my fountain pens and what I have on hand. I don't generally do a lot of journaling, so a lot of the papers that normally get used, Clairefontaine, Tomoe River, Moleskine, and Rhodia, I don't actually have. So that's the reason you're going to see the paper selection that I'm going to use. My two sort of control papers, my worst case scenario papers, are some 20-pound pen gear copy paper from Walmart, which is the cheapest copy paper I believe that you can get without buying in massive quantity. I have a pen gear composition notebook, which is also a cheap notebook paper. I have a 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. I have a 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and then my final paper I will test on is a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. So without further ado, we'll get on to the drawing test. So here's our first paper. It is the copy paper. Forgot to mention, our pen today for this test is a pina colada colored Lamy Safari that has an extra fine nib. I do actually have one other pen inked with this ink, which is a Wing Sung 601 with an extra fine, which is a much finer extra fine than this nib. However, due to the fact that I'm having another test that I'm going to do with light fastness, and the other pens, the other inks that I've tested on this paper have only been used, have all been done with a single pen and a single nib, and this particular extra fine in this Lamy is more in line with the nibs that were used in the other inks. In this running test, I'm going to limit myself to just using this one pen for this test. Alright, now this ink performed very well on this paper, considering that this is the cheapest 20-pound copy paper you can get. It performed as I expected it to. It performed as I expected it to, because I have used this ink on copy paper a lot. Like I said, this is essentially if I'm not drawing with an ink, this is my daily use ink for my fountain pens in terms of writing things, filling out things, making lists, all the kinds of utilitarian tasks that you would do with a pen. Now, unlike my other inks that I've done so far with these Polar inks and the Bad Blue Heron, which were both very aggressively wicking inks that wanted to just absorb immediately into the paper and dry almost instantly, you can see that this Legal Blue here did not immediately dry upon hitting the paper. Like, The smear test here, that first line, even it smeared a little, that was a 10-second smear test, and then obviously you see the scrub. Now, this Safari it isn't extra fine. It is still fairly wet writing, but I would say the Genhao 82 pens that I used for the Polar inks is really not less or more wet than the Safari. The only outlier here would probably be the Preppy that I use for the Bad Blue Heron. But it's a pretty good indicator that yes, this ink is not as aggressive in wicking into the paper as the other inks that I have tested so far. So next we're going to move on to the Pen Gear notebook. Actually, I told you wrong. We're not going to move on to the Pen Gear notebook yet because we have to check the back of the page. It may not even come through on camera, there is slight ghosting. Barely. A couple spots where there might have been a hint of bleed. You could absolutely use both sides of this copy paper when using this legal blue ink. It would not be a problem to use both sides of this paper with this ink. And now we move on to the next paper. So here's the writing test on the composition notebook. Now it is going to be a little harder for me to get this page under the camera because this is in a notebook rather than being loose leaf. But how well this is going to come through, unlike the other inks that I've done so far, this did not feather whatsoever on this notebook paper. Like, there's really no problems on the front side of this page. It did smear. It looks like it smeared at the 4-second line, so that means it took about 6 seconds to dry on this page, and you can see the scrub smear. So still relatively quick drying, but it didn't just instantly soak into the page like the other inks that I tested on this paper. And if we flip over to the back, you can see some ghost through the paper, but in all honesty, it did not bleed through, and that's about what you would expect to see on notebook paper like this if you were writing on it with a ballpoint pen. And I say that because I actually do write in composition notebooks, much like this one, with this ink. In fact, when I've written notes for videos I was making, I wrote them in this notebook with this ink and this pen. So I knew it was going to pass this test with flying colors, which is one of the reasons that this is an ink that I'm very fond of, personally. And so with that, we're going to move on next to the Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Now, this is the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright. So as we can see once again, it performed perfectly fine on this paper. There is no feathering, there is no, woolly letters, there's no blotting or anything that was seen with some of the other inks that I've tested. Sorry about that, I'm kind of getting out of frame. And it behaved very well. You will notice I did kind of maybe miss the one smear with my finger there, but it's smeared down starting at the 2 seconds, so about 9 seconds to dry on this paper, it looks like, and you can see the smear from the scrub test. So like I said, once again, it's not wicking in to the paper as aggressively and as fast. Now, there is, starting with this paper, there's a little bit of shading. There's several parts in the letters where you can see a little bit, I don't know if this is even going to come through on camera, where you can see a little bit of a darker blue hue at the ends of some of the letters where I ended the pen stroke, but it's not a lot. This isn't really a full-on shading ink. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. I think if I was using a larger, wetter nib, you might see more of a change, but it's generally speaking a pretty consistent blue, and it was like that on the other papers that I tested. So now we're going to move on to the Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And here is the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Alright. So, much like with the other papers I've tested so far, this one, once again, is working perfectly fine on this paper. Now, the lines may not look quite as clean because this is a toothy paper. It's got a texture to it, more so than the other papers. You will notice that it did slightly smear on that first mark, so it's taking a little longer than 10 seconds to fully dry at the end of the stroke. Most of the pen stroke was dry, but where the pen ended up, when I lifted the pen, was still wet, and you can see that the scrub mark was, smeared, obviously. Now this is a paper that all of the inks have smeared on because this is not a very absorbent paper. And like I said previously, there is the slightest hints like it wants to shade here, but really it's pretty consistently the same hue of blue. Like if you look real close where the pen strokes ended, it might be slightly darker, but it's generally speaking a pretty even hue of blue. It's not really a shading ink. And as far as the back of the paper, this is a 50-pound paper, but it's thin for a 50-pound. However, because it is non-absorbent, none of these inks have really ghosted or shown through on this paper. And so now we'll move on to the Canson mixed media paper. And our final test here is going to be on the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. Alright, and such as with the last papers, all the papers so far that I've tested with this ink, once again it passes with flying colors. Now this is the paper that all of the inks have done pretty well on so far, even the temperamental inks, and as you can see, this Noodler's Legal Blue is, well, it's doing just fine like it did on every other paper. You will see it did get a slight smear at the 10-second mark, and it did smear all the way across, mostly on the parts where the actual pen strokes ended. The rest of it had already kind of dried in, and you can see the immediate scrub and smear. So, and obviously, like with all the other inks, this 98-pound paper is about the thickness of cardstock, so none of these inks have bled through this. It's also not a very absorbent paper, so none of the inks have bled through this. And so, yeah, it's just this particular ink is a very well behaved ink on the majority of papers I've used it on, and this test so far just reinforces what I have already seen in my general use of this ink. So now, to address the lack of shading, I have done some of my own poor man chromatographies, and this is the one that I did for the legal blue here. Now, this is a poor man chromatography because this here is just a paper towel that I did the line on, and I did this chromatography in a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water at a roughly 30% alcohol to water. And as you can see, it's pretty much the same shade. You can see where the initial line was, but it's pretty much just the same shade of blue all the way up that, gets lighter as it goes up because the ink gets thinner. There's no real chromatic changes. There's no layering. There's no other colors. And as I've shown in some of my other videos, I've done this with most of my other inks that I'm going to be testing, some which I haven't tested yet, and some of them, even on this paper towel, have shown an actual chromatic change. Now, obviously, this is not the ideal paper for this. That's why I call it my poor man's chromatography. And if somebody were to repeat this with a proper paper, proper filter paper, you would see more. But just on what I'm looking at here, it's not surprising that we didn't see any kind of shading. It's just consistently the same hue of blue. So maybe that helped somebody. Maybe somebody wanted to see this for what it's worth. But, here it is. And now for our last test, I'm going to do a quick water resistance test. This is a little scrap of 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to draw a grid on here. I'm going to wait 30 seconds, and I'm going to take a little pipette. I'm going to drip water on that sample, leave it for 10 seconds, rub it into the paper, and then dab it off with an absorbent tissue, essentially. And then we're going to see if any ink lifts off onto the tissue, and if any of the ink moves or runs on the paper. Now, I don't know how well this is going to show. I did manage to lift some ink. A little bit. And you can't really tell. Actually, when I was rubbing my finger, I could see that the water was turning slightly blue. And there's a slight blue hue, I don't know if that's going to show up, on the tissue itself. But the ink is still fairly well on the paper, and it actually didn't bleed into the paper. So if I had to guess, I'm thinking, of course I rubbed the ink, I rubbed the water in. I'm going to think that where I ended the lines, and you can see the darker spots where the ink would have taken longer to dry, probably are where that ink lifted from. But as you can see, the lines are still very clearly there, and they did not run or feather into the paper. So I'm going to go on a limb and say if this was set to dry for longer, there's a good chance it wouldn't have lifted anything. But based on what I see here, this appears to be a fairly water-resistant ink. And it's supposed to be, this ink, I guess it was designed specifically for writing legal documents, signing checks and things. And it was designed to be very hard to remove from the page, and also to be able to be forensically analyzed batch to batch. So even if somebody has tried to forge a signature with the same ink, but it came from a different batch, it can be forensically analyzed to be determined not to be from the pen of a particular owner. That's according to the information I've read about this ink. Of course, that's not necessarily why I use it, but it is a very water resistant seems to be permanent ink. And now, going forward, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but one of the things I am going to do, as well as doing my ink tests here, is either with the Koh-i-Noor or this Blick page, or maybe both, I'm going to be doing a long-running light fastness test. Once I have finished this page out with some other inks that I plan on testing, I'm going to tape this page in my window, in one of the windows on the south side of my house. It is March. The sun is still more towards the south where I live, so it will be in direct sunlight, and I'm going to tape these up facing outwards in direct sunlight with direct UV light exposure. And I'm going to write on another portion of the page with a ballpoint pen and probably a Pilot G2 gel pen as sort of a control. And after a month's time, I'm going to bring these back in. I'm going to write on them with the same inks to compare to see how much, if any, shading or change in hue has happened. So that is a test to look forward to in the future with these particular papers and the inks that I've written on them with. But that's all I have for this video. I thank you for watching. If you watched it all the way to the end, I especially thank you. If you wouldn't mind dropping a like and leaving a comment, tell me what I did right, tell me what I did wrong. If you have any kind of input on how I could make my videos better, all comments, all feedback, both negative and positive, praise and criticism, it's all good. It all helps me make better videos in the future. And if you watch several of my videos, watch this one, you really like what you see, I would really appreciate a subscription. It would help me out greatly. Anyways, that's all I got for today. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.